If you've ever taught Edgar Allan Poe, Jack London, or John Steinbeck, you've likely had a pretty in-depth conversation about the power of setting. This is probably also true if you head over to Europe and you think about any of the Victorian Gothic romances that came out of the Austens, the Brontes, you name it, even like Victor Hugo, all kinds, Les Mis. I'm thinking about all of these classic novels. So many classics that we teach have a setting that is almost its own character, right? The setting propels our story, our characters, conflicts, everything forward. And understanding setting is not something unique to only one or two novels. It is shared by so many. So why don't we take setting as a jumping off point to kind of cross-analyze different approaches of looking at setting and building setting. How do different authors do it? And how can we take something that's maybe a little older, a little crustier, and like no shade to Steinbeck or Jack London or, some of these other authors, it's fine. But what if we use this as a point to give our students exposure to some other types of things? This is video number 4 in our series of using close reading as supplemental text lessons. I, of course, am your host, Amanda, and I am so happy that you are here. This is something that I have been doing professionally as a teacher for a very long time, but it's also the most frequently requested professional development that I give at schools across the United States, even internationally. It's also the most requested thing that my one-on-one teachers that I coach ask for when we actually sit down to plan units together. And so I'm really excited to talk about this particular topic because setting is another one that I feel like doesn't always get the love it deserves. Don't worry, I saved characterization for the end. There's actually 2 videos about characterization. But characterization is the one thing that I think always gets the love it deserves. But setting, I think we kind of assume that setting is just, it's there and it's fine. And oftentimes it's not really that hard for students to understand what the setting is. They can figure it out. They know, okay, the grass is green and the house is on the hill, and the raven is in a dark and stormy night. Cool, right? There are a lot of tropes. There are a lot of predictable settings. There are a lot of ways in which students are comfortable with setting, and that's great. But once again, our goal is to take students beyond observation. We don't want them to stop at telling us, oh, there's a storm, so therefore the setting is moody, it's dark. We want to talk about how that's connected to plot, conflict, character complexity, tone. There are all these other things that are linked together with the setting, the way that the setting is shared, when the setting is shared, and how it's all wrapped up in other things. We want to give students the tools that they need in order to start connecting setting to other dots. And that's where true literary and rhetorical analysis come into play. Setting, of course, is going to end up on the literary side, but things like metaphor, things like personification, those are things that appear in both straightforward language argument, but also in literary works as well. So today we're going to stay on the literary side, and today's piece is really powerful in that we're going to get to, again, kind of like in our episode or our video number 3, we're going to get to pull students out of some traditional settings, some traditional novels, and into a novel that maybe they wouldn't get to read whole class, or maybe won't get as much attention as some other text would. Today, I want to share with you the novel Divine Rivals. And for the life of me, I woke up early this morning to try and find my copy, and I think I may have lent it to someone. I can't find it anywhere. I did all of the prep for this workshop using it, and now, for the life of me, like I said, it's It's in the Lost and Found. But I don't need to hold it up in order for you to believe me that this is an incredible novel. Divine Rivals is a book in a series. It's a fantasy novel. And when I say fantasy novel, I kind of want to laugh at myself, even with We Are All So Good at Smiling. The fantasy and We Are All So Good at Smiling is much more allegorical. Divine Rivals is true YA fantasy. This is a genre before maybe the beginning of this year, I had this much interest in. Even for the sake of recommending to students, I was not there. I was not in it. And then something happened. I think I was just influenced by my really good teacher friends, and I decided to just give them a shot. So I love Divine Rivals as its own work. I don't know that I would ever teach it whole class, but it was a really enjoyable read. And honestly, in the passage we're going to look at today is the opening passage from the novel. And that's where I got hooked, was that opening passage. So this could actually double as a first chapter Friday lesson too, because this is going to be the beginning of the story. It's when the setting is set up. I have a lot of suggestions for pairing. I kind of went over them at the beginning. I would love to see this paired with a Gothic setting. I think that there are a lot of similarities between a Gothic romance, so a Wuthering Heights, a Jane Eyre, the first description of Thornfield Hall. All of those novels would work really, really well alongside Divine Rivals in a conversation about setting. I also think it would be really cool to look at A Raisin in the Sun. A Raisin in the Sun, and many other plays, but this one just is coming to mind right this second, is Hansberry's opening description of the set on stage and kind of how she uses color, dark, light, objects. She kind of sets everything up in a way that really sets the tone for the relationships and the events of what's to come in that first scene, and then later we find out for the rest of the play. So if you haven't looked at that might be a really cool pairing too. Really, any novel you have, any play that you have that has an impactful and kind of slowed down description of setting would be a wonderful pair. And again, this is going to sound like a repeat, but it bears in mind, right? We want to have this in mind when we're doing our work. I want you to choose passages where the setting accomplishes a purpose other than just being the setting, right? Does the setting create a mood, tone, or atmosphere for a particular relationship, for a particular event that happens in the plot? Is the setting and its details part of the foreshadowing of something that's to come? What is, you need to read this setting description and decide, what is it that I would write about? What do I see this setting connected to? Once you figure that out, then you can kind of see the pairings. Do the pairings need to be equal? Should the two settings be similar? Not necessarily, because the conversation is going to be about how do authors use setting to accomplish other purposes, right? What is the purpose of using a setting, using the details within the setting to reveal the relationship between two characters, to set a mood at a certain time in the story, right? If you can ask that question about both passages, and even if the authors do it differently, beautiful. That's exactly what we want students to recognize is, oh, okay, this author treated setting in this way, this author treated setting in that way, and two different things were achieved. These are authors' choices. This is how they work. That is the goal of this kind of pairing, and why maybe bringing in a YA book or a page, a supplement, a close reading supplement to another unit. That is the goal, is to kind of break out of that single novel mentality and remember that we can look at these authors' choices, right? As I kind of gave you that metaphor a few videos ago, as the analyst up in the box, right? We're watching the game, we're watching how it's played. This coach does this with his players, and this coach does this with her players, and this is effective in this way, and this is effective in this way. I like this better, I don't like this as much, but they can kind of be a little bit more on the sidelines in a good way. Students sometimes feel like they just have to know things And we don't always realize that there are some things that we do actually just expect them to know. And this is the way of doing direct instruction without it being, you must know these things in this order. We're directing them where to go. We're giving them the lane line where we want them to swim, but they get to determine, right, how they get from point A to point B, what stroke they're going to use, what, right, the metaphor is not that great, but I hope you get the idea, right? We're trying to close that for students so that they can practice the skill of analysis. We can see their critical thinking deepen, and along the way have some really good conversations about the writing and how we communicate what we see in a text when we read it. So let's jump into this beautiful YA fantasy, Divine Rivals, and check out the first chapter. Alrighty, it is time to jump in to setting and mood. I really love this passage. I think one of the advantages of this passage is it's actually page 1. So in some of the other things that we've looked at during our training, it would require a little bit of some context or a setup. In this case, you still could give kids a setup or, maybe a little heads up about the genre, but even that, there's really nothing else that anyone had before they started reading this novel that your students wouldn't have. So they're welcome to just jump right in and look purely at setting and mood. So here's what we are looking for today. We are going to highlight descriptions of the setting that reference temperature, highlight descriptions of the setting that reference color, and highlight descriptions of the setting that reference specific sensory details. So I hope that this is also helpful to you as a teacher. When you have students looking at setting, here are some ways to break it up. The way I come up with these is based on what's actually in the passage, but it helps students notice different things about the setting rather than just kind of this ambiguous word, the setting. And a lot of times students will be very focused on the physical objects of the setting, like, is there a tree? Is there a bench? Things like that. So here we're kind of directing them to look at these more literary things that are going to have that impact on tone and mood that we're trying to get at in the first place. I also am, this is a little bit, again, of a scaffolding suggestion, is being very direct about what students are looking for. So highlight examples of how Iris feels about her brother leaving for war. Telling students what the passage is about is fine. I've talked about this before in the way that we write our questions. We don't have to make them guess what this passage is about. You can, right? We definitely want to get to a place where students are determining the purpose of the message or the purpose of the passage on their own. But for what we're trying to do here, right now we're talking about setting. We don't need to create any more mysteries. So I just told them straight up, this passage is about how Iris feels about her brother leaving for war. So they can also highlight things in yellow where they notice more on the emotional side. And as you will see, all of these things combine to create, ta-da, mood. So we have 3 different setting highlights, an emotional component, and that is all to answer this question in the passage above. How does the author use details from the setting to reflect the mood of the passage? Right? It should be a no-brainer. Everything that we highlight should add up to a variety of correct, awesome, brilliant answers. This is a very supported way of teaching this kind of stuff. And it's okay to do this regularly. Let students get good at it before you start pulling pieces away. A lot of questions I've been getting in the first couple of trainings, the first few videos, were about the lesson planning itself. I will be providing additional work inside of our course framework. But if you haven't heard me say it before in the podcast or in other videos, gradual release of responsibility is the answer, right? Start with things together, right, as a whole class, and then slowly start to distance yourself from the process and then kind of work from there as students build their confidence. So let's see what we come up with in terms of the author using details from the setting to reflect the mood of the passage. Okay. I remembered to put my highlighting guidelines down here this time. So in pink, temperature; in green, color; in orange, sensory details; and yellow, we got some feelings. All right. Cold fog had settled over the depot like a burial shroud, and Iris Winnow thought the weather couldn't have been better. She could hardly see the train through the gloam, but she could taste it in the evening air: metal and smoke and burning coal, all woven together with a trace of petrichor. The wooden platform was slick beneath her shoes, gleaming with rain puddles and piles of decaying leaves. So we've got temperature, right? It's cold fog, cold and wet, and she loves it, right? This is Iris's, like, this is her jam. She is not upset, which is a surprising and kind of cool way of getting characterization right out the gate. So we know that this in a lot of ways could be an ideal kind of a day for her. And she could hardly even see the train. That's how foggy it is. Everything about the earth and the train, the metal, is all very visceral in this moment. So we kind of get a feeling for this setting being very industrial, but also, right, very maybe wooded or natural too. It's not, this is not a futuristic world. This is she's tucked in the woods somewhere. And it's a little bit old school too if they're burning coal. When Forrest came to a stop at her side, she stopped as well, as if she were his mirror. This paragraph is going to give us a lot of characterization. It's not super connected to the setting, so I'm just going to keep skimming because we'll be here forever otherwise. I won't be gone, only a few months. Her brother glanced at her in the fading light, waiting for her to respond. It was eventide, the moment between darkness and light, when the constellations began to dust the sky and the city lamps flickered to life in reply. Iris could feel the draw of it, Forrest's concerned stare and the golden light that illuminated the low-hanging clouds, and yet her eyes wandered, desperate for a distraction, a moment to blink away her tears before Forrest could see them. Well, I guess I probably could have highlighted this in yellow, and I didn't. Okay, let's do that. So we've got here color happening, darkness and light. The lamps are flickering on and off. We've got fading light with this. Everything about this moment is heading into darkness. So the setting is heading into darkness. We're starting to also get the sense that Iris is about to lose something that's very precious to her, her brother. We know from the annotation directions that her brother is leaving for war. We're also getting this sense of their relationship being is a good one, right? We know that. So already the setting is starting to mirror Iris's feelings about losing her brother, him getting on this train and heading off to war. She's crying, right? She's blinking away her tears, but she's also trying to stay strong, right? So she's very much trying to be the tough girl here. Pink is more temperature coming up. She crossed her arms to ward off the autumn chill and the strange cadence in Forrest's voice. There was a hint of desperation she hadn't heard in him until now, and goose flesh rippled across her arms beneath her thin sweater. He didn't know when he'd return. It was a promise he couldn't keep to her, although he continued to make it sound as if the war would end in a matter of months, a war that had only just begun. In this next part of the scene, Forrest gives her his coat, his jacket. She tries to refuse it, but she ends up taking it. She accepts the trench coat. She's got, it's too big for her, but it comforts her, kind of feels like armor. And then we get back into more setting here. As a reminder, orange, we have sensory details, green, and color. And then yellow is her feelings. This was it then, right? This is the moment. The platform was nearly empty of soldiers, and the train was hissing through the gloom. A knot welled in Iris's throat. She bit the inside of her cheek as Forrest embraced her. She closed her eyes, feeling the scratch of his linen uniform against her cheek. She's really getting emotional. This is really getting difficult. The platform was nearly empty, meaning that they have been saying goodbye longer than anyone else there, that their attachment is really strong, and having to separate is incredibly difficult. And she's really trying to not cry. There's something about her and maybe their relationship where she feels she really does feel the need to not fully embrace how she's feeling. So that's an interesting thing about their relationship and kind of her emotional state. Iris followed, right? Finally gets on. He rushes to board the train. Iris followed until he disappeared into the closest car. She lifted her hand and waved, even as tears blurred her vision. We got more tears, and she stood on the platform long after the train had vanished into the fog. Rainwater was seeping into her shoes. So now, like, the fog is now completely rain. It's in her feet. She's not bothered by it, right? She's not complaining about it. She's not trying to move to another place. It's seeping into her shoes. She's stuck in place. And we've got this really wet and heavy sensation from the description of the fog, and now the rainwater seeping into her shoes, holding her in place in this time, in this moment where she's losing her brother. I think this would be a great place to ask students, could this setting and mood description help us make the leap or state a claim, right? Maybe this is a little far of a reach, but maybe this is a good thing to talk to students. Does Iris think her brother will come back? Does Iris think that her brother will actually return from war? And then supporting, right, their claim with the way that the setting and the mood is in this moment, and how that is an indicator of whether or not she believes he'll return. These are kind of the cool conversations that you can have when you're looking at something really specific. It says here that the crowd had dispersed. Iris felt hollow and alone as she began to walk home. And then at the very end of this passage, she finds in the pocket of Forrest's jacket a little piece of paper. And on it, she couldn't resist smiling. And she read, "Just in case you didn't know, you are by far the best sister I've ever had. I'm so proud of you. I'll be home before you know it, little flower." Again, like, this will be a very interesting detail to look at. It's not really connected to the setting, but it's connected to the moment where the setting was really signature in what was happening, and whether this is a positive reassurance or a real bad omen. That this one would be more of a guess, but the other questions and other discussions would absolutely be based in what's happening here. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you're feeling really, really excited about looking at setting and mood in both this text and whatever other text you're looking at. It would be very cool to pair this with another kind of, like I've talked about earlier, like another gothic, gloomy, moody type of story, but also something completely different. Something with a sunny, beautiful day might offer some cool compare and contrast, juxtaposing conversations. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and I look forward to seeing you in our next training. Bye-bye.